thank you very much for coming on this uh, Wednesday evening, or probably earlier in the day in some of you. We're very, very pleased indeed to have Dr. Aaron Kheriaty speak to us today. If you're not familiar with, we are the Bar Centre. We are sort of run on a shoestring, and we're very much about defending the Hippocratic ideal of medicine, which I think is very relevant to Dr. Kheriaty's latest book. You can find out a little bit more about us in the chat. There's also a donate button. I have to sort of vulgarly mention that. Any help you can give us or following our work, then please do get in touch, and you can do that in the chat. Dr. Aaron Kheriaty is a physician specializing in psychiatry, and he's a scholar and director of the program in bioethics and American democracy at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He was for 16 years professor of psychiatry at UCI School of Medicine and director of the medical ethics program at UCI Health, where he chaired the ethics committee. And while at UCI, he was awarded the Excellence in Teaching Award 3 times by medical students. And he is the author of 5 books, including most recently, and this is the book he will be talking about tonight, Making the Cut, How to Heal Modern Medicine. So without further ado, Dr. Kheriaty.
Thank you, Anthony, for that kind introduction. And it's good to be with all of you. I am on the other side of the pond, as they say, in Southern California. So it's 11 a.m. my time, bright and early. And I'm delighted with the invitation to talk to you about some of the themes from my latest book, Making the Cut. And I'll just put a shameless plug for the book here. In the top of the chat box, I put a link to the Amazon page where you can order it. You can order it from other booksellers as well if you're interested. I'm going to begin my remarks with the first paragraph of chapter 5 of the book, just to give you a flavor of some of the medical narrative. My job was to hold the leg until I was holding just the leg. The electric saw was buzzing, bits of bone were flying, and a tendril of smoke wafted up from the point where saw met bone. We were performing an amputation. It was a surprisingly quick operation, no more than half an hour. Above the knee, the resident made a circumferential cut with a scalpel, tied off the few major leg vessels, and continued cutting until he reached bone. Then it was time to pick up the saw, an instrument that did its work quickly, until the leg came off in my hands, floating free from the patient's body. It was heavier than I expected. I handed it to a nurse who put it in a plastic bag marked biohazard and carried it out of the operating room. I wondered what they did with these biohazards. So my book attempts to do 3 things. It chronicles my medical training with stories and anecdotes like the one that I just read to you. It attempts to propose a sound philosophy of medicine. And finally, it offers a pretty stringent critique of our contemporary healthcare system with some suggestions in the last chapter on how we might address some of the current problems. And this is a story, my training was a story of surprises. Almost everything in medical school astonished me. I was permitted to do things in medical school that, if you stop and think about it, would have been considered crimes. They would have been felonies if done in any other context. Things like practicing unperfected procedural skills on patients or carving up a dead body in gross anatomy lab. I first sensed back in medical school that the house of medicine was not entirely well. And I believe the condition has actually worsened in the 20 years since then. Now, certainly as a med student, I got to see medicine at its finest. I saw a dogged resident apply every ounce of her intelligence to diagnose an illness that was so rare that there were only a few dozen cases that had ever been reported in the literature. I remember watching a cardiologist shock a man back to life as the patient was teetering on the brink of death. I saw surgeons and assistant surgeons who replaced dead organs with living ones to give patients a new lease on life. So I saw amazing things. I also, medicine is not always glamorous. It's not always life-saving organ transplants. I was naively unaware when I first entered medical school that among my duties would include manually disimpacting an almost 500-pound severely constipated man who screamed in agony for his mother, despite the fact that we loaded him with morphine prior to this rather gruesome procedure. So I learned, a physician's work is not always glamorous. A doctor does what needs to be done for the sake of the patient. There's a downside to seeing something done well, because then you know better what it means to fall short of that standard. So yes, during med school, I was lucky enough to see medicine at its finest, but I think that vision only served to amplify some of its serious failures, which I try to address in the book. And I would say to this day, I remain both an insider and an outsider to medicine. I'm a grateful practitioner, and I'm also a concerned critic. So this book presents a pretty sharply critical diagnosis of contemporary medicine, but I try to apply the wounding scalpel in order to heal. Medicine is, of course, an ancient profession that has made astonishing advances in recent history. Who among us wants to return to the days of the 19th century when surgeons amputated gangrenous legs and removed cancerous breasts without anesthesia? Who wants a world without antibiotics, even if these wonder drugs are now becoming less effective by the year, breeding treatment-resistant bugs through overuse? Nobody, I think, wants a world without ventilators and dialysis machines, which can maintain life after organs fail. Even if too many unfortunate souls are consigned by modern medicine to a kind of bare biological life, permanently tethered to these organ replacement technologies with no hope of meaningful recovery. Modern medicine may be a mixed blessing, but we have to acknowledge that it is a blessing. But for all its impressive advances, medicine still meets with only modest success. And today it appears to be getting diminishing returns despite continued technological innovations. So we're curing more cancers today. But as it happens, at least in the United States, I think in the UK as well, we're contracting more cancers. We live longer, but with more years of chronic decline and disability, and many diseases from muscular dystrophy to Alzheimer's to autism remain largely outside the ken of science and beyond the healing powers of doctors. We know that many medications work, but we often have no idea how they work. Medicine, in fact, often claims knowledge and powers it doesn't actually possess, and the public is typically more than willing to play along. On the other hand, I think more people today are waking up to these facts, questioning our healthcare system and doubting conventional wisdom in medicine, especially after the mishandling of the COVID pandemic. We see this in the US, for example, in the so-called MAHA movement, the Make America Healthy Again movement that's part of the current administration. When our medical institutions are compromised by money, by power, by other interests external to healing the sick, and when medical schools start succumbing to ideological fads, when they spend more time teaching and talking about climate change or social justice as they understand it, and abandon the teaching of the basic sciences and the medical arts, then the risks to individuals and society can't be overstated. It's not that those issues are not important, and I'm not here to take a particular ideological position on those issues. It's just that medical education has become about many things that have nothing to do with medical education. So somewhere along the way, medicine itself, you might say, got sick. A recent survey of almost 500,000 Americans published in the Journal of the American Medical Association showed that trust in physicians and hospitals plummeted 30 points following the COVID crisis, from 72%, a majority of Americans, to only 40% today. Another recent post-COVID Pew survey likewise found that a majority of Americans, 71%, doubt that medical scientists will act in the best interest of the public. This was a 10-point increase compared to just a few years prior. Meanwhile, we're grappling with an epidemic of chronic illness: heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, Alzheimer's, stroke, etc., that is now affecting 6 in 10 Americans. I'm not sure what those numbers are in the UK, but I think they're comparable. And in many ways, medicine seems powerless to fix this problem. And in fact, starting in 2014, the overall life expectancy of Americans has declined for the first time since the 1918 influenza pandemic. So that's a statistic that's really hard to game, right? All-cause mortality, age-adjusted all-cause mortality. When that goes up, and when the total life expectancy goes down, the big picture is not looking good, let's say. Why is this happening? Well, sad to say, the highest aim of modern medicine today very often is not so much health, but rather efficiency. Medicine today has typically become more adept at controlling bodies than curing them. Like other fields, it has fatally succumbed to what I call managerialism, the belief that through the accumulation of rational knowledge, everything can and should be engineered and managed from the top down, typically by a small group of bureaucrats or technocrats. And I think it matters little whether the management is coming from government bureaucrats, as might be more the case in the British National Health Service, or it's coming from massive corporate conglomerates, as is the case in the US healthcare system. In both instances, managerialism ignores the fact that every patient is unique. No sick person wants to be sort of processed through an industrial turnstile medical system that treats every patient exactly the same. I'm going to say a little bit more about this later at the end, if there's time. I think this kind of problem starts with medical training, where students are conditioned from very early on in medical school to view the human body as nothing more than a complex machine, a sort of assemblage of more or less replaceable parts. My first patient in medical school was already dead. My only job involved painstakingly dissecting her lifeless corpse in the anatomy lab, reducing every inch of her body to tatters until there was literally nothing left to cut. I took her apart, I pulled her to pieces, but I never learned her name. And she never knew mine. As far as I knew, she was an anonymous person with no social or psychological life, no family, no community, no context, merely a lifeless body lying on a steel table. Unfortunately, I think medical students observe death before we observe life. And by the way, I think gross anatomy dissection labs are the best way to learn anatomy. So this is not a critique of that method of learning, but the fact that we put it at the very beginning of medical training before students are even exposed to what a living human body looks like in the surgical operating room, for example, I think creates a kind of problem for the way in which the imagination of medical students is shaped and formed. Medical students observe death before we observe life. And I personally only learned 2 years later in the surgical operating room that a living human body looks very little like a dead one. And I think that the order of operations here powerfully shapes the ethos and the imagination of future physicians. It kind of sets the the tone for the entire practice of modern medicine. Beginning with Gross Anatomy Lab, the dead body becomes medicine's template for understanding the living human organism. The med student constructs his knowledge of the human body on the foundation of a static, frozen in time, lifeless, decontextualized corpse. And then this, so to speak, dead knowledge is later overlaid onto the dynamic bodies of actual living human beings. The corpse, ironically, is the normative starting point against which the dynamic flux of life is supposed to somehow be understood. And I argue in the book that this gets things backwards. One of the things it does is that it trains us to begin seeing the living body as a machine, as dead matter somehow kept in motion by mysterious forces that we don't understand. Consider, for example, this dubious claim from a contemporary textbook of medical physiology, the kind of textbook you would encounter in a school of medicine. Quote, "The human being is actually an automaton. And the fact that we are sensing, feeling, and knowledgeable beings is part of this automatic sequence of life." So this kind of materialist, reductionist view of the living body as mere dead mechanism is not actually new. We can find its roots in the advent of modern science, including the science of physiology, which I describe a bit in chapter 2 of the book. Physiology, which is supposed to study precisely the dynamic processes of life. And I think this sort of dead mechanistic model continues to ail medicine to this day, and it has profound consequence for how we view and how we treat patients later on. Contrary to this mechanistic picture, real biological life is an intricately choreographed dance that can't be captured in a static photograph. The machine model of the human body persists in our imaginations, I think, not primarily because it's true, but because it encourages the sense that we can easily understand what life is and then learn to control it, which is a tempting proposition for medicine, is a tempting proposition for our Faustian age. So I think we need a new medicine that's attentive, not just to decontextualized mechanistic forces, controlling blind biological functions without purpose, but a medicine that's attentive to meanings and intentions and loves and hopes and fears and embodied purposes and all the richness of an actual lived human life. That is to say, we need a medicine that treats human life as always embedded within a larger community and a larger context of meaning. The chapter in the book on death and dying opens with the following anecdote. "Where are you going?" I asked the medical resident on call one evening. "I thought we were grabbing dinner from the cafeteria." "I know," she replied, "but I just got paged. I've got to go take care of something real quick. I'll meet you there in 10 minutes. "Do you need help?" I asked. "No, thanks. I'll take care of this one. I have to go declare a patient." I wondered for a second. You need to declare a patient what? Declare something to a patient? Tell a patient something? No, I heard her correctly. Declare a patient. She avoided saying that she had to go declare a patient dead. This was my first clue that there was a word physicians almost never used. In fact, they often played elaborate language games to avoid mentioning it. Not long after that, during morning rounds, I noticed that a patient who had been on our service the day before had disappeared. I didn't think there had been plans to discharge him, so I asked, "What happened to Mr. James?" Matter-of-factly, the resident said, "He expired last night." Again, I was puzzled. He expired? Coupons expire, milk expires, but people die. There it was again, the D word, studiously avoided with a weird euphemism. It turns out it's not just doctors who avoid the subject of death. We live in a death-denying society, as the cultural anthropologist Ernst Becker explained 50 years ago in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book titled The Denial of Death. Becker argued that death denial was the central driving force shaping contemporary society and human behavior. He believed that the modern age had lost the cultural and religious resources to deal with death. So, as a consequence, we try to repress thoughts about our mortality. But as the old psychoanalysts taught us, that which we repress doesn't thereby disappear. It returns in the form of personal neuroses and cultural pathologies. In other words, death still haunts a death-denying culture, and it haunts a death-denying medical system. We can try to avoid it, we can try to deny it, but we can't ultimately escape it. Medicine will no doubt continue to improve over the next 50 years. New cures, hopefully better surgical techniques, therapies we haven't imagined yet. But I personally hope that the biggest advances will emerge in medicine's ability to accept its own limitations. And as I argue in the book, death represents the unsurpassable horizon against which we practice medicine. The futile attempt to try to defeat death through biomedical science, the dream, for example, of the transhumanist movement, the dream of many of our contemporary geneticists, will only result in undermining rather than enhancing our humanity. Contrary to some of the blank checks that these overzealous geneticists and transhumanists are writing, the last enemy, death, will never be fully conquered by science and technology. For life is a sexually transmitted condition that is invariably fatal. I'll say that one more time. Life is a sexually transmitted condition that is invariably fatal, and it always will be. The human mortality rate continues to hold steady at 100%. Okay. What does it mean to call medicine a profession? And this gets to the title of our talk here related to what does it mean to be a good doctor? In modern usage, we've become accustomed to calling just about any occupation a profession. But this, you may know that this was not customary in the ancient world. For the Greeks and the Romans, the term profession was used to designate only 4 occupations. The first was medicine. The other 3 were law, teaching, and the priesthood. So you might ask, okay, what do all 4 of these have in common that maybe other occupations wouldn't necessarily share? Well, all 4 are characterized by a distinctive kind of personal relationship at their center: the doctor-patient relationship, the lawyer-client relationship, the teacher-student, and the priest-penitent relationship, where one member is especially vulnerable and in need of help, and the other member of the relationship promises to provide just such help through healing or legal counsel or teaching or spiritual care. Because of the imbalance of power in these relationships, great harm could come to a person if one of these professionals abused their privileges, right? If your lawyer doesn't have your best interest in mind, you may not achieve justice. You may be imprisoned unjustly for a crime that you did not commit, right? Obviously, we're all familiar with the ways that doctors can very seriously harm patients if they abuse their privileges. So for these fiduciary relationships, for these relationships that were grounded in trust to even be possible, individuals and society in general needed to develop trust in the goodwill of these professionals, to maintain confidence in their training and their competency, and most of all, in their upright motives and intentions. And one of the chief means of convincing society that these professionals were trustworthy was the tradition of a public ritual, where initiates made a solemn and binding public promise prior to engaging in their work. According to the original meaning of the word, they were professionals precisely because they professed a public oath when they commenced their career. And of course, in the case of physicians, this was the Hippocratic Oath, where doctors promised to use their learning, their privileges, their powers, always and only for the purpose of health and healing of the patient who came to them for assistance. Physicians solemnly swore to minimize harm, to maintain confidentiality, to avoid exploiting the patient, abusing their power, and so forth. And the original oath, you may know, explicitly forbids the infliction of specific kinds of wounds, wounds that constitute perennial temptations for medicine. Healers can and sometimes necessarily do wound. Indeed, we often heal precisely by wounding, as when a surgeon wields a scalpel. This inescapable fact rightly troubles us. But doctors can also injure through error, and we can injure by means of role confusion. Like when we use our medical knowledge and skills to participate in something like capital punishment or torture, something that is not aimed exclusively at health and healing. So Hippocrates composed his oath precisely to forestall this kind of role confusion and to make clear to potential patients exactly how Hippocratic physicians would and would not use their knowledge and skills. We should always avoid deliberately injuring, and deliberately inflicting death, of course, constitutes the ultimate injury. That physicians inevitably wound, even when they're trying to heal, makes medicine dangerous and makes a public promise, a solemn and binding oath, necessary at the outset. Medicine must be grounded in moral limits, in the ability of physicians to say no to certain types of requests. I think we neglect this at our peril. By contrast, however, modern versions of the Hippocratic Oath, including the version administered by my medical school, discard some or all of these prohibitions in favor of vague, unspecified humanitarian aspirations. For example, the oath taken by students at the University of California, where I taught in the School of Medicine for 16 years, was written by the students themselves, which I think is hardly an example of joining a tradition from the Latin tradere, which means to hand on something that doesn't belong to you. Diverse pledges of dubious origins have today replaced a common medical creed. So society seems to want medicine to remain a profession. They seem to want to hold physicians to a high standard. We all of us sense that a doctor shouldn't be merely a technician or even just a humanitarian. But on the other hand, we can't seem to agree on what the doctor should and should not profess. That we no longer have a common oath suggests that we no longer really have a shared understanding of what it means to be a physician. So one of my suggestions in the book is, well, perhaps the specific oath that each physician takes should later be posted on the wall in their office so that future patients can at least know what their physician did or did not promise. Some patients armed with this information might choose to seek out a traditional Hippocratic physician, while others may be content with a mere technician of medical power. Okay, a few other thoughts before we wrap up, and I think there should be time for Q&A at the end. But I wanted to circle back and talk a little bit about managerialism, which I mentioned earlier. Like many other contemporary institutions, since I think the Second World War, medicine has succumbed to the ideology of managerialism, the unfounded belief that everything can and should be deliberately engineered and managed from the top down by a cadre of supposed experts. And I make the case in the later chapters of the book that managerialism is destroying good medicine. This ideology consists of several core tenets. I'm going to walk through very briefly just a few of them. The first is a kind of technocratic scientism, the belief that everything, including society and human nature, can and should be fully understood and controlled through materialist, scientific, and technical means, that science itself constitutes the only valid form of knowledge, which, by the way, is not a scientific claim. It's a metaphysical claim, but leave that aside for a moment. The idea here is that those with supposedly superior scientific and technical knowledge are therefore best placed to govern society and best placed to manage everything within our healthcare institutions. In medicine, this manifests through the metastatic proliferation of top-down, well, they call them guidelines that are imposed on physicians to dictate the management of various illnesses. But I think guidelines is, in fact, a euphemism designed to obscure their actual function. Some of these come from professional medical societies, but many come from state and federal regulatory authorities and public health agencies, and probably in your country, places like the NHS. They control the physician's behavior by dictating payments and reimbursement for hitting certain metrics. Back in 1990, just a few decades ago, the number of available guidelines for physicians in the United States was 70. By 2012, there were over 7,500 such guidelines. In this kind of managerialist regime, the physician's individualized clinical discretion goes out the window. It's sacrificed on the altar of unthinking checklists. The second tenet of the managerialist ideology is utopian progressivism, the belief that a perfect society is possible through the precise application of scientific and technical knowledge, that, so to speak, the arc of history bends toward utopia as more expert knowledge is acquired. I think the disastrous experiment in gender affirmative care on children, which is starting to fall apart. The UK is a little ahead of the US in this because of the Cass report that was published there earlier. I think this is just one manifestation of this utopian progressivism infecting the house of medicine, the idea that we could use medical technology to not just heal the sick, but to fundamentally recreate human nature itself, that the human body is a mere blank slate upon which we can write just about anything. The third feature of this managerialist ideology is liberationism, the belief that individuals and societies are held back from progress by the rules, restraints, relationships, historical institutions, communities, and localized traditions of the past, all of which are necessarily inferior to the newest, latest, and greatest. Contrary to this ideology, as I try to argue in the book, there are some things in medicine that will never change. That at its foundation, medicine is not constituted by a particular technology, but by a particular kind of relationship, a relationship based on trust between a patient made vulnerable by illness and a doctor who professes to use his knowledge and skills always and only for the purpose of health and healing. No technological advance, no new societal development will ever or should ever fundamentally alter this. And the ends or purposes of medicine are therefore baked into the kind of profession that it is. They're grounded in permanent realities of health, illness, and the human body. Finally, the fourth feature of the managerialist revolution is a kind of homogenizing universalism, the belief that all human beings are fundamentally interchangeable units of a single universal group, and that systemic best practices discovered by scientific management are universally applicable in all places and for all peoples. Therefore, any particularity or diversity of place or culture, custom, nation, government structure, anywhere is evidence of an inefficient failure to converge on the ideal system. According to this tenet, when taken to its logical conclusion, progress always naturally means centralization and homogenization. And again, we see this everywhere now in medical institutions that function according to the principle of efficient people moving. In this system, patients themselves become the manufactured products of a standardized, industrialized healthcare system. I don't know the details of how this works at the NHS, but I'm sure it's very similar to what we see here with the way in which the federal government makes bundled payments to hospitals that incentivize hospital administrators to move patients through the system as quickly as possible. So a patient who takes a bit longer to recover from surgery or who develops a complication becomes a financial liability for the hospital. This statistical outlier is then resented by the hospital administration, for not behaving according to the principles of maximum efficiency and patient uniformity. Throughput is a favorite buzzword of hospital administrators, at least in the United States, who copy the people moving engineering of Disneyland to create turnstile systems that shuffle people through the medical machinery, though without necessarily resolving their issues. And in the process, physicians have become glorified data entry clerks, staring at a computer screen in the consulting room, rather than engaging in face-to-face dialogue with their patient. Doctors often ask a series of questions dictated by external managers that have little or nothing to do with the patient's chief complaint. And then patients leave these encounters feeling bewildered, unheard, unhelped, and very often unhealed. Okay, so much for the diagnosis of contemporary healthcare systems. Do you have a treatment plan, Dr. Kheriaty? Well, the only solution, I believe, I don't have time to get into this in detail, and a shameless plug, you'll have to read the last chapter of the book to really unpack my argument here. But in a nutshell, the only solution, I think, is the development of decentralized parallel medical institutions, new models of clinical care and reimbursement, started by physicians that opt out of the perverse system entirely. I make the perhaps surprising claim that to save medicine, we must limit medicine. We must help individuals reappropriate responsibility for their own health, thereby limiting the expansive industrial scope of contemporary healthcare systems. Somewhat paradoxically, the cure for our epidemic of chronic disease may require less, not more, professionalized healthcare. And again, to hear that argument fleshed out, which may sound counterintuitive, you'll need to read the last couple chapters of the book. Contrary to our technocratic fever dreams, human nature is not infinitely elastic. It has inherent limits that medicine will never overcome, however powerful or technical our tools might become. And I think consistent with such limits, it's time for us to develop a more decentralized, small-scale initiatives that operate more autonomously, apart from the managerialized systems of medical power. I could talk a little bit about how this might be done in the United States. I have no idea how it would be done in the UK. It's probably more challenging there with the way in which the NHS really sort of monopolizes healthcare. So you all may have more difficulty implementing the kinds of ideas I want to promote in this regard than might be possible in the United States. But essentially, I argue that we need for medicine what the Czech dissidents against communism in the 1970s called a parallel polis, which would supplement the beneficial and necessary functions that are missing in the existing structures. It doesn't try to do away with the existing structures entirely. It uses them when necessary. And whenever possible, it tries to humanize them from within, but it also finds creative ways of working outside the system to fill in the blanks for the system, the things that the system is doing poorly. All right, in closing, I'd like to just tell one more brief anecdote from the book, which is a brief chapter, of course, in the long history of medicine. The history of medicine is a story which is very old. And a student once asked the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead a fascinating question. The student asked her, "What is the earliest sign of human civilization we've discovered?" The student probably expected her to say something like a piece of pottery or perhaps a fragment of a handheld tool from thousands of years ago. But Mead replied that the first sign of human civilization was a healed femur, a 15,000-year-old human thigh bone. If you think about it, in a primitive hunter-gatherer society, a person with a broken leg would have nothing to contribute to the functioning of that community. In fact, the injured patient was only a drain on the collective resources. They were a kind of group liability. The bone would have to be set by someone in the tribe who possessed the requisite skill to do that. And while it slowly healed, the injured person would have to be carried from place to place and fed and sheltered and tended to for months, a project of the entire community, without that person having any ability to contribute to the survival of the community under very, very difficult circumstances. And yet, what we found when we discovered this healed thigh bone was that this person did live long enough for the broken leg to heal. And this means that he was cared for by a knowledgeable healer and supported collectively by the entire community, even at considerable cost and at some risk to the welfare of others. This was perhaps the first sign of a civilized society. So, when I'm tempted to become cynical about the future of medicine, I find it helpful to recall that this venerable practice of healing the sick just might signal the very dawn of human civilization. And contrary to popular belief, perhaps medicine really is the oldest profession. Thank you all for your attention. I'm happy to open things up to conversation, comments and questions. I don't just want to field questions. If you have things that you'd like to contribute, I would love to hear what everyone here has to say.
Do you mind if I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. What do you think the legislative or maybe legal pathways are in the United States in order to have a more decentralized regulation of medicine?
Yeah.
So like we can all say that we want it to be decentralized and for there to be competition among the regulators, which would be great. But I just don't know exactly how we get there through statute or through courts.
Yeah. So theoretically, because medicine is regulated under the US Constitution by the states rather than the federal government, we should have 50 different experiments going in 50 different states. The problem is the state medical boards are all strongly influenced, if not controlled, by the Federation of State Medical Boards, which is a private but national institution that often dictates state medical board policies, right? So even though I'm licensed in the state of California's medical board is influenced by this kind of unaccountable group. Same thing happens in medical education. Medical schools in the United States are regulated by the LCME. I forget what the acronym stands for, license something, 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 something. Residency training programs, graduate training programs are regulated by the ACGME, the Accreditation Council on Graduate Medical Education. I think we should break up the monopoly of the LCME and the ACGME such that it's possible to seek accreditation from other accrediting agencies, or it's possible to gain a medical license from a state-approved medical school that's not accredited by one of those agencies. So people with particular sort of ideological bent that want to control all of medical education take control of these accrediting bodies and then march around and tell every medical school in the country what to do. So I think we need to, and that can be done at the federal level, that can be done at the state level. That just having a few states saying you could sit for the state medical licensing exam as long as you're coming from a school that we approve of, even if it's not approved of by one of these other accrediting agencies. That would help to break up the monopoly. We have to come up with creative payment and reimbursement systems. So one of the models that I talk about in the later chapters is known as direct primary care. So people that are wealthy can pay for concierge physicians. You could pay out of pocket in the United States to get exactly the kind of personalized medical care that you want. And that's great for people that have the means, but for the other, 97% of the population that can't afford a concierge physician, there are models of sort of subscription-based models of what has been called direct primary care that are cropping up here and there. working somewhat within, but at the same time, somewhat outside the system of billing and reimbursements that's usually dictated by by Medicare, by the federal government. The private insurance companies in the United States tend to follow the rules for reimbursement set by Medicare. So that really centralizes control of billing practices with the federal government, with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. And direct primary care is one attempt to do an end run around some of the issues with how do physicians get paid. And a lot of these are proving early on to be financially feasible if they're rooted in local communities that buy into it and support them. So that's just one model that I mentioned. And I essentially say, I don't have all the answers in this regard. I'm trying to diagnose the big picture problem. I'm trying to mention a few examples of what a parallel polis in medicine might look like. I have a few of my own ideas. A couple of them I just mentioned about how we might break up the monopolies. But creative minds better than my own can come up with others. And sometimes all you need is, one state to implement something novel, road test it, and others will see that it's working. Or they did this in Louisiana, we can try it in Iowa as well. And then, if it's feasible and patients like it and they're voting with their feet and it's cost effective and we're getting better medical outcomes for less investment, then it could spread. Probably more challenging in a country like the UK that has essentially a single payer government run healthcare system, and getting out of those, which, by the way, I didn't come here to critique the NHS. The NHS has its virtues as well. I think there's no such thing as a perfect healthcare system, and I wouldn't claim the one we have in the United States is better in all respects. There's things that you guys do better than we do, and there's things that we probably do better than you do. So there's trade-offs with any healthcare system. But in general, I would like to see more opportunities for people to work outside of the system. I'm able to do that in psychiatry. It's one of the few specialties in the United States where you could just opt out of the insurance reimbursement system entirely. So I have a cash-based practice where I charge people on a sliding scale, and I rob from the rich and I give to the poor, and I charge people whatever they can pay. And you're able to do that in psychiatry. It's much harder to do that in other medical specialties that have higher overhead costs, and where you're dealing with not the cost of a psychotherapy visit, but the cost of a surgery. You can't really run a cash paying practice for most people. So I'm a little bit privileged in that I have a solo practice that's able to operate almost entirely outside of the managerialist system. But I would like to find ways for other physicians to be able to do that kind of thing. And there are some models percolating out there right now that may prove feasible in that regard.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize time too much. My only quick comment is that I'm curious how much CMS actually coerces the current licensing regime. Like, is it going to be easy for states to actually change their licensing procedures if they still want their physicians and hospitals to receive CMS reimbursements?
Yeah, so right now, that's a good question. So right now, Medicare, CMS pays for most residency training, right? So that also gives them, so we think of Medicare as, well, they're the ones paying for healthcare, especially for older people or people who are on various forms of disability. That's their job, is to provide health insurance to especially older Americans, but some other Americans as well. But residency training, post-medical school, is largely also paid for by CMS, and that gives them a lot of control over residency training programs and how they are run. So to loosen that grip would require coming up with alternative ways to fund residency training as well, which is a serious challenge that I don't necessarily have a good answer to. There are there are ways to do this in public policy. Maybe states pay for residency training rather than the federal government. Maybe they get block grants from the federal government to support the training, graduate training of physicians. I mean, there's, you could come up with 10 different policy proposals on how to deal with that and how to break that monopoly. But I'm generally in favor of more decentralized options, which would empower states to do more and the federal government in the United States to do less. Because then at least you have some competition between the states, and you have some experiments, and some of them will work and some of them won't work. But it will also allow states to tailor the healthcare delivery needs to their own populations, right? I mean, rural populations have different needs than urban populations. So different states should be able to, run their residency training programs and their medical schools, for that matter, differently, in order to, better meet the needs of the local population, in my view. Luis.
Okay, thank you. Louise, if you could unmute. By the way, if anyone doesn't want to speak, you can type a question in the chat and I'll read it out. But Louise, go ahead.
Thanks for your presentation, Dr. Kheriaty. I'm a clinical psychologist, work in research, McGill University and UCSF, and specialize in trauma. I have data in support of your hypothesis, which is when I looked with a colleague, a psychiatrist, at the relationship between the therapeutic alliance and the outcome in pharmacotherapy, 41% of the variance was explained by the therapist relationship.
Quality of the relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. So
no, that's fascinating because we've known that for psychotherapy, but that psychopharmacology has the same influence is
actually it's higher in pharmacotherapy. In average, in psychotherapy, it's 30% of the outcome that explained.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And now it's 41% that we found.
Yeah, amazing. So, well, send me that paper. I would love to see. I would love to see that.
How about if I send it to Ellen and Ellen sends it to you? I don't have your
deal.
Okay, sounds good. I have another point that I have. Sorry, I want to be fast. Another point that I have. Oh, I resigned from psychiatry department at McGill, by the way, because of how they conducted their research. I did not agree with their ethics. I noticed by hearing from residents in psychiatry that they had rotations of 72 hours nonstop, not allowed to sleep. In my book, Trauma Therapist, you know what? That is, I'm sorry, my dog, ailment. This is sleep deprivation. This is torture.
Yeah, it's abusive. Yeah.
And this is a means that they've used to force obedience upon physicians. Yeah. And my sense is that physicians, despite their sometimes sense of superiority and power, they have a deep-seated anxiety of being sued, of being out of the norm, of disobeying. So if in the training to help physicians to be more disobedient to the protocol, so to speak, more relational and creative, I believe that that should be terminated. And they should have normal hours.
I agree with you. When I went through training, we didn't have work hour limits. Congress, after I graduated from med school, passed the 80-hour-a-week limit, and also a limit that residents weren't supposed to work more than 24 hours in a row. That trickled down to medical students. But I had 110-hour work weeks. I didn't have 72-hour shifts, but I had 36-hour shifts. Every few days on some rotations in medical school. And I had a chapter. In fact, I cut some of that material from the book because it's become less of a problem in the United States. Sounds like it may still be a serious problem in Canada, though. So, I mean, I completely agree. There are aspects of medical education that are, quite frankly, abusive, and I recount some of those in the book. And physicians have become overly conformist out of fear of litigation, out of, there's a whole confluence of factors that have made it difficult for physicians to really be scientists and ask questions and propose new hypotheses and think creatively. And so that's a serious problem in medicine. The one other comment I'll make about the first thing you said, the quality of the therapeutic relationship, is there's been a lot of research recently on physician burnout, because physicians are leaving medicine in droves, or they're retiring early. It's going to create a physician shortage problem in the United States. Why is this happening? Now, the long work hours are bad, but it turns out that's not the most important factor for physician burnout. The most important factor is not that doctors are working long hours. They're willing to put in more work than most professions might require. But the burnout occurs when they don't feel like they can maintain a good quality relationship with their patients. When they become glorified data entry clerks, staring at a computer screen, engaged in so many administrative tasks that their face-to-face time with patients diminishes. And when they don't have the freedom to exercise the discretionary latitude to tailor the treatment to the individual patient, then they experience a kind of moral injury. There's some interesting literature in the bioethics world as well, as concept of moral injury. And that is what causes physicians to burn out. The long work hours are a problem. And, in extreme cases, they can be downright abusive to trainees. But if we want to address the problem of physician burnout, it's not just about reducing work hours and having more shift work and having more time off. It's about allowing physicians to engage in meaningful relationships with their patients. That's what sustains doctors in the practice of good medicine.
Okay, thank you. Ilaria, if you could unmute.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I have a kind of a question. I had the privilege to read your book, so my question probably is also prompted by reading the book, but you mentioned something in the talk as well. I was very much fascinated by the fact that in your book and today, you would like to empower patients. Patients have responsibility for their health, and medicine can assist, but the patient has to do the hard work. Is something that you said in the book as well.
Right.
But at the same time, at the beginning of your talk, you said that in general, doctors treat patients as machines. There is this kind of idea of managerialism, technocratic, something that I mean, the doctors have been embedded in this kind of mindset. But at the same time, I mean, I was struck by a story of your book when a patient, if I remember well, a patient had heart surgery because of a stroke, but it was, I think, it second, something like that. And in the meantime, he didn't do anything to improve his well-being. And the doctor felt quite helpless. He said, okay, I have done this surgery, but I don't think this patient is going to survive unless he takes responsibility of his care. And so my question is, like, in a certain way, I think the risk is that the patients as well think about their body as a machine. I go to the doctor and the doctor is going to fix me.
Exactly.
In particular, because patients are within the same society as doctors, as everyone else. So and maybe...
That's an excellent point. I think the mentality infects both doctors and patients. So patients take a sort of passive approach to their own health until something goes seriously wrong. And then it's, what are you going to do to open up the hood of the car, reach in with your tools and fix it? And a traditional Hippocratic view, and I'm sorry, I hope I didn't cut you off, but your comments are triggering some thoughts that I wanted to share, if that's all right, Ilaria.
Yeah, sure.
The traditional Hippocratic view of the body is that the body itself is the primary agent of healing. So a surgeon doesn't actually close a surgical wound. A surgeon adheres two tissues close enough to each other that the body itself can heal the surgical wound. Antibiotics, which we think of as zapping the bacterial infection, antibiotics don't actually clear infection from a body. What they do is they lower the infectious load sufficiently that the body's own immune system can then clear the infection. If you're severely enough immunocompromised by HIV/AIDS, for example, antibiotics don't work because they only have an ancillary role in helping the body to do what the body was designed to do in the first place. I could come up with more examples, but these illustrate that, you know, open up the hood and fix the car is not the right framework for most of what physicians do. It's helpful in some contexts. If, God forbid, you get hit by a truck on your way home, go to the nearest ER and let the trauma surgeons patch you back together. Acute physical trauma, medicine is very good at dealing with that. Chronic disease, we're really struggling with. Promoting health-related behaviors, we're really struggling with this. And this is not entirely the fault of physicians, and it's also not entirely the fault of patients. There are also environmental factors. You know, in the United States, we're having a lot of conversations now about the quality of our food and the toxins in our food and the things that we're allowing into our food that are contributing to the obesity and metabolic syndrome epidemic. And, you know, so there are public health things, there are agricultural things, there are society-wide things having to do with, you know, removing toxins from the environments that are making us sick, that are also necessary to give patients the freedom to make healthy choices, right? If your only choices in the supermarket are all garbage, even if you want to, it's hard to promote, you know, healthy eating, for example. So there's not one bad guy that we can point the finger at here. I think in general, physicians are well-meaning. They're doing the best they can within a very often broken healthcare system. It's also not always fair to just point the finger at lazy patients who are not taking care of themselves, you know, smoking and drinking and eating too much, because lots of patients actually are really trying. And our obesity epidemic in the United States is not because people are so much lazier than they were 40 years ago. It's because our entire food supply is making them sick, right? And so it's hard to lay the blame at any one or another factor. I think there are multiple factors playing a role here, but I think all of us need to get away from the mechanistic model. Patients included need to develop some sense that I can take responsibility for my own health, and I should take responsibility for my own health. Use medicine when it's necessary. But even then, that medicine should help my body do what my body was designed to do better. And I should participate and facilitate that process rather than just seeing myself as the passive recipient of whatever procedure or pharmacological product you want me to ingest, which may be helpful, but that's typically only part of the story of what's necessary for healing.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So is there anybody else who has a question or a comment? You just raise your hand or leave something in the chat. Ilaria, sorry, do you just want to follow up? Yeah.
Just a tiny follow-up on this. My experience recently, I went to see a physician for my daughter, and his first question to me was like, okay, what do you know about this issue? What did you Google? Did you use ChatGPT? in this way, I mean, I didn't do anything of that, and apparently was the first in the day that didn't do anything like that. But this made me feel like, again, that it's a very, I mean, it's a thin balance, the one between, I mean, the relationship between the doctor and patient. And what I've noticed within the NHS system, for instance, because I'm based in London, is like the NHS system is free of charge.
Yeah.
But you have to, I mean, you have to wait for your turn, and it can take 6 months.
Yeah.
And maybe that specialist is not the one that you really need.
Yeah.
So you are referred to another one, and you have to wait again. Instead, the private system, I guess, is very similar to the one in US. So you have an issue, you pay, so you are treated quite. The thing is that what I've noticed is that when you have to wait 6 months, you want to be fixed, because you cannot you cannot bear the idea that you need to wait more time. But at the same time, because you have to wait 6 months, in a way you have to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot, I mean, in those 6 months you have to live. So you have to, I mean, take responsibility. So this is just a little glimpse of maybe another system which has some pros and of course some cons.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want patients to be left entirely on their own for 6 months trying to figure out everything using ChatGPT. I mean, that's not what I mean by, you know, more personal responsibility for your health. It has to be a cooperative enterprise between the patient and a physician that they actually have access to. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's obviously an enormous challenge for countries to figure out an affordable healthcare system that works and that has sufficient access that when you need help, you get it, and you're not waiting forever and languishing and suffering unnecessarily in the meantime. I could give a whole other talk on the role of AI in medicine. My own view is that it can be used as a tool, but it shouldn't be used as an idol or an oracle of wisdom or a replacement for medical judgment. So I've had patients come to me and say, well, I use ChatGPT or Grok to ask, what are the common side effects of this antidepressant medication? And, you know, assuming the algorithm's drawing on sound sources of information, it might be able to spit out a helpful half-page summary that could augment the conversation that I'm having with the patient about a proposed medication. That, it seems to me, is very different, and that bothers me a lot less than other patients who have gone to ChatGPT and said, given my medical history, should I take this antidepressant medication? You know, and then they assume, well, Dr. Kheriaty can't read all the papers in the research literature on, you know, fluoxetine, and ChatGPT can. So ChatGPT is probably wiser than Dr. Kheriaty when it comes to making a recommendation in this regard. And, you know, so handing over what should be a very personalized decision and a nuanced, informed consent process, handing that over to bots and to machine algorithms strikes me as a pretty reckless enterprise. So anyway, we could spend another hour talking about AI and medicine and the pros and cons, but my own view is if we can keep it in its place and use it as a tool, it can be a useful tool. But if we begin to anthropomorphize it and, you know, see it as our treating physician, that could lead us to potentially to a lot of harm.
If I could just ask a quick question. I mean, what you're proposing is sort of rediscovering an internal ethic of medicine. And I'm just wondering what scope there might be in improving medical ethics? Because certainly my understanding from speaking to people in England is it's very minimal, it's very crude.
Yep.
They talk about 4 principles, which there's no sort of coherence between them.
Yeah, and how do you adjudicate between them if they appear to come into conflict? It's arbitrary.
Exactly. So there's no kind of philosophy behind it. And I mean, in a sense, you're proposing an ethical renewal within medicine.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm curious as to what's medical ethics teaching like for many American physicians.
It's exactly what you just described. 4 principles. I think medical educators like the principalism, which came out of Georgetown, which is where I did my medical training. Beecham and Childress, famous book, The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. I think medical educators like them because there are 4 of them, and medical educators like multiple choice exams. So we can throw some ethics questions on the exam, and which of these principles is relevant to this scenario or this case history or something like that. But yeah, it leaves students totally bereft. So when I taught the required ethics course at UC Irvine, I didn't start with principalism. I started with an account of the nature of illness. First of all, what does illness do to a person? It leads them reluctantly to enter into a relationship with a particular kind of person. I described the asymmetry of power and the need for trust. And then I say, well, what is a person in that vulnerable, sick state, lying on a gurney, curled up in pain from acute appendicitis, in the emergency room? What do they naturally expect from their physician? And from there, you can begin deriving something akin to principalism. Well, they want help, and they want you to minimize harm. They want you to treat them fairly and not according to extraneous factors like, race or sex or their religious beliefs or any. So you can get a sort of justice and autonomy rightly understood, which is not give the patient whatever they want, but present the medically reasonable options and try to engage them to the degree possible, to the degree that they have capacity in the process of informed consent to rewrite that imbalance of power that's characteristic of the doctor-patient relationship. So my approach was sort of a phenomenology of the doctor-patient relationship. And then from there, you could almost derive principalism in a way that was orderly. So I would argue that beneficence is the first principle, not non-maleficence or not do no harm, because everything we do is potentially harmful. And if that was the overriding principle, we would never do anything, right? So the goal is not never do harm. The goal is minimize harm whenever possible and make sure that the potential benefits are commensurate and sufficient to override the potential risks. So that was my approach to teaching ethics. And then the other thing that does is, if you start with an understanding of illness and the nature of illness and the nature of healing, then you see that medicine has a built-in telos. It has an end, it has a goal, it has a purpose, which is health and healing. And then you can ask, is this practice of gender confirming care, or I prefer the term sex rejecting procedures, I think is more accurate, conducive to bodily health? Well, no, it's taking a healthy part of the body and deliberately injuring it, actually making it more unhealth and you can analyze euthanasia on the same principle. So I think there's 2 fundamentally different philosophies of medicine. There's a Hippocratic philosophy that says medicine should always be aimed only at health and healing. And you can derive an ethics from a kind of phenomenology of illness and the profession to heal. Or there's a technocratic medicine that basically says, if it's technologically feasible, if the physician can do it, and if someone, the patient or someone else, is willing to pay for it, then it has to be done, or it should be done. And I think that spells the end of good medicine. But medicine is moving increasingly in that direction. You hear it in some of the language from, doctor-patient to provider-consumer, is, sort of language derived from the marketplace. or purely contractual language, as though the doctor and patient had equal negotiating power and were able to get up and walk away from the negotiating table if they didn't like the terms of the negotiation. So I think you have to start. Yeah, I think we need a new medical ethics and internal morality of medicine that starts with the fact of illness as a universal reality, and then the longstanding fact that society has designated people that should be trusted as healers and not deployed for other things.
Yeah.
Like if society wants to accept euthanasia, I don't think we should, but it shouldn't be done by physicians, right? If you're going to insist on doing this, have a trained cadre of thanatologists whose only job it is to kill people, right? And let physicians be healers.
Well, I mean, I think one of the problems is, well, two problems really, but in moral philosophy, there's a very strong tendency to deny that there are special spheres of moral philosophy. So medicine would be one, sexual and reproductive ethics, which I've done some examination in. That's sort of regarded as parochial or superstitious, or you should have a technical solution which applies across the board, and that's what
this is the homogenizing universalism that I mentioned earlier. It's I mean, that's utilitarian ethics, even a Kantian ethics would do that to the idea of professional ethics for medicine.
In medical ethics here, you have principles.
Those are your options,
Yeah, it's consequentialism or something called deontologism at a very shallow level. And of course, neither of them captures what you're talking about. Good. Okay, Helen Watt, if you could unmute.
Yeah, I wonder whether even if, as I think you should, you centre medicine on health and healing, what about this very traditional but slightly ancillary role of medicine, which is to make people feel better, as in the palliative role of medicine?
Sure.
Now that will often be promoting functioning, because the patient will be able to talk to people and have a more normal life. But what about extreme cases where the patient has to be made unconscious because their pain is so serious? In some ways, that's a very traditional thing to do, because because comfort is part of the traditional role of medicine, but it's not promoting functioning because the patient can't do anything because unfortunately the patient is now unconscious.
Yeah, that's right. So I need to clarify that healing doesn't always mean curing, first of all. And that especially at the end of life, and this is my whole sort of death is the final horizon that we have to practice against. We have to accept the limits of medicine. I think, we cure when that's possible, but we never abandon care, and care is always possible. And I think palliative sedation under certain circumstances is arguably the best form of care, right? It has risks and benefits, right? You would prefer the person to be conscious and alert in their last days so that they can say and do the things that matter most with their family and friends at the end. But if they're not able to even do that because it's just intolerable and intractable and agonizing pain, then the caring thing to do may be palliative sedation. And sometimes it's possible to put somebody in a state of palliative sedation for a day or two and then slowly draw them out. You break the pain cycle, and you can do little attempts to help them regain some degree of consciousness. So palliative sedation also doesn't have to be an all or nothing phenomenon. But I would argue within a sound philosophy of medicine, something like that should certainly be included. So I use the word healing in a pretty capacious way that would hopefully encompass palliative care at the end of life. I mean, one of my favorite palliative care doctors here in the States, up in LA, Ira Byock, wrote a book called The 4 Things That Matter Most in the End. And he's a palliative care doctor. And the 4 things that matter most were not lorazepam and morphine and palliative sedation. They were, thank you, I forgive you, please forgive me, I love you. And those are healing. And medicine can facilitate those conversations, or it can impede those conversations. It can facilitate those conversations by being honest with patients about when we've reached the limits of medicine, and not continuing to operate under the delusion that continued aggressive care or one more round of chemotherapy might just do the trick, right? I think very often we rob patients of those healing opportunities by our attempts to cure when cure has become impossible.
Okay, are there any final questions or comments? Now's the time. If not,
thank you very much.
Oh,
thank you, John. Thank you all for being here.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Kheriaty, for an extremely thought-provoking talk, which really gets to the heart of the nature of medicine, which is very much what BIOS is about as well. I would encourage you all to get hold of Dr. Kheriaty's excellent book. There's a link in the chat. And just remains, just to say a huge thank you to Dr. Kheriaty. And if any of you want to sign up to Bios's future talks, then just get to us via the website. There's also a donate button. But thank you very much again, Dr. Kheriaty, and well, let us hope that things improve as a result of your work and the work of others.
Thank you, Anthony. Appreciate that. Thank you all for being here. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, everyone.